Officer Rachel Owens had pulled over many cars in her 5 years on the force, but this time, something felt different. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the car slowed down too perfectly, as if the driver had been expecting to be stopped. Maybe it was the way her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her flashlight. But none of that compared to the moment she saw it. The tattoo. Her breath hitched in her throat. The world around her seemed to blur as she stared at the ink on the man's arm. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was that tattoo. The one she could never forget. The one that had haunted her for years. Rachel's hand hovered over her holster. She should say something. Ask for ID, follow protocol. But she couldn't move. Couldn't think. Because if that tattoo was real, if this man was who she thought he was, then everything she believed about her life had been a lie. The night had started like any other. A cold breeze rustled the trees along the highway, and the sky stretched dark and endless above. Rachel sat in her patrol car, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. She hated the night shift, but she had learned to live with it. Most nights were quiet. Drunk drivers, speeding teenagers, the occasional reckless chase that made her heart pound. But tonight, she had a feeling something was coming. Then, she saw the car. A black sedan, rolling slowly through the intersection just a few miles outside of town. Its headlights were dim, its movements too cautious, too controlled. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't swerving. But Rachel's gut told her something was off. She turned on her lights and followed. The car didn't pull over right away. For a moment, Rachel thought the driver might run. But then, just as she reached for her radio, the sedan slowed and rolled onto the gravel shoulder. She parked behind it, taking a deep breath. Routine stop, just like any other. Rachel stepped out of her cruiser, adjusting the belt around her waist. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she approached the driver's side window. The glass rolled down. A man sat inside, his face half hidden in shadows. He looked to be in his 40s, with dark stubble along his jaw and tired eyes that held something Rachel couldn't quite name. License and registration, she said, keeping her voice steady. The man didn't speak. He reached into his glove compartment, moving slow, deliberate. Her hand rested on her holster, just in case. Then she saw his arm, a sleeve pushed up just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo. And that was when the world stopped. Rachel was 16 when she last saw that tattoo. It was on a night much colder than this one. A night filled with fear, with flashing lights, with the sound of her mother screaming. The man with the tattoo had taken everything from them. He had walked away, leaving only pain in his wake. Rachel never thought she would see that ink again. Never thought she would face the person it belonged to. Yet here she was. The man's fingers closed around his ID, but Rachel couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Was it him? She had to know. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. Where did you get that tattoo? The man's hand froze. His eyes lifted to hers. And for the first time that night, Rachel felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pure, unshakable terror. The man's eyes met Rachel's, and in that split second, she saw something flicker behind them. Recognition, fear, or maybe something else entirely. His fingers hovered over his ID, but he didn't hand it over. He didn't move. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears. The night air suddenly felt too thin, too sharp. I asked you a question, she said, her voice low but firm. The man exhaled slowly, like someone carrying the weight of 1,000 regrets. It's just a tattoo, he said, his tone careful, measured. Rachel knew better. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was that tattoo. A black emblem, slightly faded, stretching over his forearm. A small mark in the center. 3 lines forming a shape she had traced in her mind for years, trying to forget. Trying and failing. Her fingers curled tighter around her flashlight. Step out of the car. The man didn't argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt, moving with the ease of someone who had done this before. But Rachel noticed something else. His hands weren't shaking. His shoulders weren't tense. This man wasn't afraid of her. That terrified her even more. 15 years ago, Rachel had been just a teenager, sitting on the floor of her mother's bedroom, clutching a stuffed bear that smelled like home. Then the door had burst open. A man had stood there. Not just any man. A man with that tattoo. The memory came rushing back now, uninvited, suffocating. Her mother's voice, pleading. The sound of breaking glass. And the last thing Rachel saw before everything turned into a blur. The ink on his arm. A mark she never forgot. A mark that was now standing in front of her, under the dim glow of her patrol car's headlights. The man stepped out of the car, his hands raised just enough to show he wasn't a threat. He was taller than she expected, his face lined with age, but Rachel could still see it, the traces of the man from her past. She just didn't know if it was really him, or if her mind was playing tricks on her. "I need to see your ID," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man pulled out his wallet and handed it over. Rachel's eyes scanned the name. Daniel Lawson. It didn't ring a bell. Her gaze snapped back to his face. "This your real name?" He didn't flinch. "Yes." Her hands clenched. Was it possible she was wrong? Could this be some horrible coincidence? But then why did her stomach churn with certainty? She glanced back at the tattoo. The exact shape. The exact placement. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Where did you get that ink?" Daniel exhaled again, like he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. "It's a long story." Rachel narrowed her eyes. "Try me." For the first time, Daniel's expression softened, just a little, like he knew something she didn't, something she wasn't ready to hear. The radio on Rachel's shoulder crackled. "Officer Owens, do you need backup?" She hesitated. She should say yes. Call for another unit. Bring him in for questioning. But a strange instinct held her back. "I'm fine," she replied, never taking her eyes off him. Just a routine stop. A lie. She wasn't fine. Nothing about this was routine. And as she stood there, staring at the man who might have destroyed her family all those years ago, she had no idea what would happen next. Rachel's grip on the man's ID tightened. The name, Daniel Lawson, felt unfamiliar, but that tattoo, that was something she could never mistake. Yet, as she stared at him, waiting for an explanation, something gnawed at her. He didn't look like a criminal. She had spent years picturing this man, this monster from her past. In her nightmares, he was always cruel, his face twisted with rage, his hands filled with destruction. But the man standing before her was calm, worn, and his eyes, they weren't filled with menace. They were filled with something else. Regret. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay professional. "That's not an answer," she said. "Where did you get the tattoo?" Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. "I don't think you'd believe me if I told you." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Try me," he sighed, glancing down at the ink on his forearm. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. Rachel's patience snapped. "And what exactly do I think, Daniel?" She took a step closer, her pulse hammering. "Because I've seen that tattoo before. I know what it means. And I know what the man who wore it did." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. "And what if you're wrong?" Rachel's breath hitched. Wrong? How could she be wrong? She had spent 15 years chasing the memory of that night. 15 years remembering every little detail. And the tattoo, it was the one thing that had never faded in her mind. Could it be possible that she had made a mistake? No. She shook the thought away. She wasn't wrong. She couldn't be. Her voice was steady when she spoke again. "I need you to turn around and place your hands on the hood of the car." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He turned slowly, placing his hands on the cool metal. Rachel reached for her cuffs. Her fingers brushed against the steel when a sudden bang shattered the silence. A gunshot. Rachel whipped around, her instincts kicking in before her mind could catch up. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she scanned the road. Then she saw it. Another car, speeding toward them. And before she could react, the driver's side door flew open. A man stepped out, a gun raised. Rachel barely had time to duck before another shot rang out. 15 years ago, Rachel had been hiding in the closet when the gunshot started. She remembered clutching her mother's hand. The way her mother had whispered, "Don't move, baby. Don't make a sound." She had listened, and it had saved her life. But tonight, she wasn't a scared little girl anymore. She was a cop, and she wasn't going to hide. Rachel dropped behind her patrol car, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Drop the weapon," she shouted, drawing her gun. The man didn't listen. He fired again, the bullet ricocheting off the pavement just inches from Daniel's feet. Daniel didn't move. He stood there, frozen, his hands still on the hood of the car. And that's when Rachel realized. The man with the gun wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at Daniel. Rachel didn't hesitate. She fired back. The man dove behind his car. The night filled with the sound of sirens. Backup was on the way. Rachel didn't take her eyes off the gunman. "Who is he?" she demanded, glancing at Daniel. Daniel exhaled, his voice calm despite the chaos. "The reason I have this tattoo." Rachel's stomach dropped. Before she could ask another question, The gunman stepped out from behind his car, his weapon raised again. Rachel braced herself. Then the man did something she didn't expect. He smirked, and then he ran. Rachel surged forward, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Don't chase him," he said, his voice low. "Not yet." Rachel turned to him, anger flaring in her chest. "Why not?" Daniel looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. "Because if we do this wrong, people are going to die." Rachel stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Who was this man? And what had she just gotten herself into? Rachel's chest rose and fell as she kept her gun trained in the direction the gunman had disappeared. The flashing red and blue lights from her cruiser cast eerie shadows across the empty road. Daniel Lawson stood still, his hands still resting on the hood of his car, as if he were waiting for her to tell him what to do next. But his words rang in her head like an alarm. "If we do this wrong, people are going to die." She turned to him, gripping her weapon tighter. "Start talking. Now." Daniel exhaled, finally stepping away from the car, rubbing his wrist like the weight of unseen chains had been lifted. "I can't," he said simply. Rachel's frustration flared. "What do you mean you can't?" He glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Not here." Rachel clenched her jaw. This wasn't just some routine stop anymore. There was something bigger at play, and she wasn't about to let him walk away without answers. She took a step closer. "That man wasn't trying to kill me," she said, voice firm. "He was after you." Daniel didn't deny it. Rachel continued, "And you're telling me it has to do with that tattoo?" Still, Daniel said nothing. Rachel's fingers twitched against her gun. "I can take you in right now, you know that, right?" Daniel turned to face her fully. He was taller than her, broader, but there was no threat in his stance. Only quiet exhaustion. "You could," he admitted. "But that would be the worst mistake of your life." Rachel let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, really?" He nodded. Rachel hated the way her instincts told her to listen. She had been in situations like this before, cases where things weren't black and white. But never had she been this deep into something that felt personal. Backup was minutes away. She could hear the sirens growing louder in the distance. Soon, officers would swarm the area, and Daniel Lawson wouldn't be her problem anymore. So why did something tell her she needed to hear him out before that happened? She took a deep breath, lowering her gun just a little. "If you want me to believe you, start by explaining why someone just tried to kill you." Daniel studied her for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "It starts with a promise I made a long time ago," he said, "and a choice I should have never made." Rachel felt something shift in the air. She was about to hear a story that would change everything. 15 years ago, the night air had been thick with tension, the kind that made the hairs on your arms stand up before you even knew why. Daniel sat in the driver's seat of a rusted pickup truck, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The man sitting beside him, Victor Calloway, lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, his smirk barely visible under the glow of the streetlights. "This is it, Lawson," Victor said, rolling up the sleeves of his leather jacket. His voice was smooth, convincing, just like we talked about. In and out. Daniel swallowed hard, glancing at the house in the distance. A single-story home, small but well-kept. A porch light flickered. He shouldn't be here. He should have walked away the moment Victor had mentioned the job. But he hadn't. Because Victor wasn't just some guy off the street. He was the reason Daniel had survived foster care. The reason he hadn't ended up like so many others. He owed him. At least, that's what he had told himself. "You're hesitating," Victor said, flicking ash out the window. Cold feet. Daniel forced a breath through his nose. Victor's eyes darkened. "It's too late to back out now." Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew that. He had known it from the moment he had agreed. His stomach twisted. One last job. That's what Victor had said. And then, Daniel could be free. But deep down, he already knew. There was no such thing as one last job. Present day, Rachel didn't move. She barely breathed as Daniel spoke. She had expected a confession. A justification. She hadn't expected this. "You knew that guy?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "His name is Victor Calloway." Rachel's blood ran cold. She had heard that name before. Victor Calloway was more than just some criminal. He was the kind that didn't leave loose ends. Rachel straightened. "And let me guess, he's the guy who just tried to kill you?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Victor doesn't try," he said. "If he wanted me dead, I wouldn't be standing here." Rachel's stomach nodded. "Then what does he want?" Daniel met her eyes. "To send a message." Rachel took a step back, trying to process everything. The tattoo, the gunman, the history. This wasn't just about a bad decision Daniel had made in the past. This was something bigger, something dangerous, and she had just stepped right into it. The sirens were almost on top of them now. Within seconds, other officers would be on scene. Rachel knew what she should do. Arrest Daniel, let the detectives handle it. But something in her gut screamed at her to make a different choice. She had spent her entire life chasing a ghost from her past. And now, he was standing right in front of her. Her radio crackled again. Officer Owens, status update? Rachel closed her eyes. Then she made a decision. She pressed the radio button. Suspect has fled the scene, she said. No visual. Daniel stiffened. What are you doing? Rachel turned to him, her mind racing. I just gave you a head start, she said. Now tell me why I shouldn't regret it. Daniel's expression was unreadable. But then, he gave her something she hadn't expected. A small, tired smile. Because I can help you find Victor, he said. And stop him before it's too late. Rachel felt the weight of her choice settle deep in her bones. She had just crossed a line. There was no going back now. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest. The sirens were getting closer. Backup was just around the corner, and every instinct screamed at her to follow procedure, arrest Daniel, and let the detectives handle the rest. But there was something about his words, the calm in his eyes, that made her pause. I can help you find Victor, he had said. And stop him before it's too late. Rachel's mind raced. Too late for what? What kind of mess had she just stepped into? She had barely known Daniel for 5 minutes, and already he had turned her world upside down. That tattoo, the name Victor Calloway, the gunman who'd nearly taken her life, it was all connected. And yet, despite everything, Rachel felt this nagging sense that Daniel wasn't lying to her. He wasn't a criminal in the way she had imagined. At least not entirely. The radio crackled again. Officer Owens, do you copy? Rachel pressed the button, trying to steady her breathing. Copy. We've got a situation here. Another pause on the other end. Status of suspect? Rachel glanced at Daniel. He was looking at her now, his gaze intense. I need time, she said, her voice more steady than she felt. We'll need a full perimeter set up. I'll explain when I can. There was hesitation in the voice that came back. Understood, Officer Owens. But you need to move fast. Rachel clenched her jaw. She didn't need to be told that. She clicked off the radio and faced Daniel again. You have 2 minutes. Start talking. Daniel nodded. His face had gone serious. Victor's not just some small-time thug. He's part of something bigger, Rachel. Something dangerous. And if we don't stop him now, it's only going to get worse. Rachel's mind tried to piece things together. The pieces weren't fitting. What exactly do you mean by bigger? Daniel hesitated. I can't explain everything in a few minutes, but I can give you something, an idea of how deep this runs. Rachel's eyes narrowed. If you're playing me, I'll arrest you right here. I'm not playing you, Daniel said, his voice firm. But you need to understand this. Victor Calloway's not the leader of the operation. He's a foot soldier. There's someone else behind him, someone who controls everything, someone who's been pulling strings for years. Rachel felt her stomach churn. Who? Daniel looked away, his jaw clenched. His name is Anthony Darnell. Rachel's breath caught. She had heard that name before. Years ago, when she was still a rookie on the force. Darnell was rumored to be one of the most dangerous men in the city, but no one had ever been able to bring him down. And now, Daniel was telling her he was the one behind Victor Calloway. I've been trying to bring him down for years, Daniel continued, his voice low. Victor was my ticket. I thought I could get close to Darnell by working with him. But it didn't work out that way. Rachel's mind was spinning. So you're telling me this isn't just some random attack? You've been tangled up in this for years. Daniel nodded. That tattoo? It's part of a larger network. A signal, of sorts. It marks people who are involved in Darnell's operations. Some of them are willing participants. Others, he paused, his eyes darkening. Others are forced to wear it. Rachel took a step back. So this isn't just about you and Victor? This is about an entire criminal syndicate. Daniel nodded again. Exactly. Rachel's mind raced. If what Daniel was saying was true, she had just uncovered the tip of an iceberg that could go much deeper than she could have ever imagined. Her entire career had been based on chasing down small-time criminals, drug dealers, petty thieves. But this was something else entirely. Something dangerous. And she had just made the choice to dive headfirst into it. Tell me everything, Rachel said, her voice urgent. Daniel looked around. his eyes scanning the road for any sign of danger. We don't have much time. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that Victor's men will come looking for us. But if you want to understand what's going on, you need to know one thing. Darnell's network goes beyond just drugs and money. He's involved in something far worse. Something that's been quietly tearing this city apart for years. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't let him get away with it. What is it? What's he after? Daniel hesitated. His voice dropped to a whisper. Human trafficking. Rachel's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as the gravity of his words sank in. Human trafficking. The phrase was enough to make anyone's skin crawl. But hearing it now, in the middle of a quiet street with nothing but the low hum of her patrol car's engine for company, it felt like a punch to the gut. Darnell is using the city as a base for his operation, Daniel continued. And it's bigger than you can imagine. He's got connections everywhere, law enforcement, government officials, people in power. I tried to get close to him through Victor, but I failed. Rachel's mind was reeling. She had thought she had seen it all in her career. Drugs, murder, gangs, but this was different. This was a war being fought in the shadows, and she had just been handed the first clue. But Daniel wasn't finished. He's not going to stop, Daniel said quietly. And neither will his men. They'll hunt us down. They'll do whatever it takes to keep this operation running. Rachel's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if it was fear or adrenaline, but she knew one thing. This was no longer just about Daniel Lawson or his past mistakes. This was about stopping a criminal empire. And she was going to need all the help she could get. Rachel's stomach churned as Daniel's words echoed in her head. Human trafficking. She had spent years as an officer, thinking she had seen the worst of humanity. But this was something different. Something bigger than she had ever imagined. She took a deep breath, trying to push down the wave of nausea that threatened to rise. If what you're saying is true, why haven't you gone to the police? Daniel let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Do you really think I haven't tried? Rachel narrowed her eyes. And Daniel's expression darkened. Every time I got close, I was warned. A threat left in my mailbox. A car following me home. And then, people started disappearing. People I trusted. People who had tried to help me. That's when I realized, Darnell doesn't just have power. He has leverage. He's got people in high places. People who make sure the truth never sees the light of day. Rachel's blood ran cold. If what he was saying was true, this went far beyond a gang or a syndicate. This was something woven deep into the city itself. Her gut twisted. How do I know you're not just feeding me a story? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. You expect me to believe you just stumbled into this? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples like a man who had explained himself 1,000 times before. I didn't stumble into anything. I made a mistake. A big one. And now I'm trying to fix it. Rachel crossed her arms, waiting. Daniel's jaw tensed before he finally spoke again. 15 years ago, I got caught up with Victor Calloway. He told me there was a way out, a way to escape the mess I was in. I was young, broke, desperate. I thought it was just another job. His voice lowered. I didn't know what I was getting into. Rachel listened in silence. Daniel exhaled. The first job was simple. Move some stolen goods from one place to another. No questions asked. The money was good. Easy. Too easy. His gaze darkened. Then the jobs got worse. And by the time I realized what I was involved in, it was too late. Rachel didn't move. Daniel continued. Victor had me running deliveries. Cars, cash, sometimes weapons. But one night, I got sent on a different kind of job. I was supposed to pick up a shipment. I thought it was more stolen goods. He paused, his hands clenching into fists. It wasn't. Rachel swallowed. Daniel's voice was raw now. It was people. The words hit her like a freight train. I didn't know, Daniel said, shaking his head. I swear to you, Rachel, I didn't know. But when I saw them, when I realized what was happening, I froze. I wanted to stop it. I wanted to do something. His voice dropped. But Victor was there, and he gave me a choice. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. What kind of choice? Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Either I did my job, or I became part of the shipment. A heavy silence fell between them. Rachel felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. The tattoo on his arm, the symbol she had spent years fearing, wasn't just a mark of a criminal. It was a scar. Daniel let out a breath. I played along, pretended I was still on their side. But from that moment on, I started working against them, gathering evidence, trying to bring them down from the inside. He looked at her, his expression tired but resolute. That's why Victor came after me tonight. He knows I have something on him. Something big. Rachel stared at him, trying to piece everything together. What is it? Daniel hesitated. Then, he reached into his jacket pocket. Rachel's hand shot to her holster. Easy. Daniel slowly pulled out a small, black USB drive. He held it up between two fingers. This. Rachel frowned. What's on it? Proof, Daniel said. Of everything. Transactions, names, locations. Everything Darnell and Victor have done. Everything they're planning. Rachel's heart pounded. If what he was saying was true, this wasn't just a case anymore. This was a takedown. But before she could say another word, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Rachel spun around. A black SUV barreled around the corner, headlights off, moving fast. Daniel's face paled. We need to move. Now. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed Daniel by the arm and pulled him toward her patrol car. But they weren't fast enough. The SUV skidded to a stop, and the doors flew open. 4 men in dark clothing jumped out, weapons drawn. Rachel barely had time to react before one of them barked an order. Hand him over, officer. Now. Rachel's grip tightened on her gun. Not gonna happen. One of the men smirked. We were hoping you'd say that. And then, all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted. Rachel ducked behind her car, yanking Daniel down with her. Bullets shattered the windshield, sending glass flying. Her radio crackled again. Officer Owens, what's going on? We've got reports of shots fired. Rachel pressed the button. I need immediate backup. Armed suspects. Another shot rang out, and she barely dodged it in time. Daniel clutched the USB drive in his fist. We can't stay here. They'll keep coming. Rachel knew he was right. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and if they didn't move fast, they wouldn't make it out alive. Rachel's heart pounded as bullets whizzed past, shattering the side mirror of her patrol car. The men from the SUV weren't just shooting to scare them off. They were here to kill. Daniel crouched beside her, gripping the USB drive so tightly his knuckles turned white. We need to move. Rachel scanned the area. They were on an open road, no cover except for her cruiser. The SUV was blocking their escape, and backup was still minutes away, minutes they might not have. The gunmen were closing in. Rachel made a decision. Follow my lead, she shouted. She rose just high enough to fire 2 quick shots, forcing the gunmen to duck behind their vehicle. Then, without hesitation, she grabbed Daniel's arm and sprinted. Daniel followed, keeping low as they darted toward the tree line at the side of the road. Bullets tore through the air behind them, kicking up dirt and gravel. Rachel's lungs burned as they ran, her boots pounding against the earth. She reached the trees first, diving behind a thick trunk. Daniel followed a second later, pressing his back against the bark. The gunfire stopped. Rachel peeked around the trunk, her gun still raised. The men were regrouping, scanning the darkness. One of them cursed. Find them. Rachel's stomach twisted. They weren't giving up. Daniel turned to her, his voice low. We have to keep moving. They'll sweep the woods. Rachel nodded. They couldn't stay in one place for long. If they wanted to make it out of this alive, they had to be smart. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. I have a cabin about 2 miles north. It's off the grid, no cell service, no electricity. Daniel gave her a wary glance. You really think we can outrun them for 2 miles? Rachel checked her gun. 2 bullets left. We don't have a choice. Daniel sighed. Lead the way. They moved fast, ducking low, sticking to the shadows. The sound of footsteps behind them sent a chill down Rachel's spine. The gunmen were spreading out, moving carefully, methodically. They weren't just chasing them. They were hunting them. Rachel forced herself to keep going. 1 step at a time. 1 breath at a time. The cabin wasn't far. They just had to make it. 15 minutes later, they reached a clearing. Rachel's cabin stood just ahead, a small, wooden structure hidden between the trees. She had bought it years ago, using it as a retreat when the weight of the job became too much. Now, it might be the only thing keeping them alive. Rachel rushed to the door, fumbling with her keys. Daniel stood behind her, scanning the trees. Hurry, he urged. Rachel's hands trembled as she found the right key and shoved it into the lock. The door creaked open, and they stumbled inside. She slammed it shut and locked it behind them. Silence. Rachel pressed her ear against the door, listening. Nothing. For now. She turned to Daniel, who was catching his breath against the wall. His face was tense, his muscles coiled. Rachel exhaled, her heart still hammering. We need to talk. Daniel nodded. Yeah, we do. She motioned toward the small wooden table in the center of the cabin. Sit. Daniel obeyed, setting the USB drive down between them. Rachel stared at it like it was a ticking time bomb. This, she said, tapping it, better be worth it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It is. Rachel grabbed her laptop from the nearby shelf and opened it. Let's see what's on it. Daniel hesitated. Are you sure? Once you see this, there's no going back. Rachel met his gaze, her expression hard. I crossed that line the second I let you go. Daniel gave a small nod. Rachel plugged in the USB. Her laptop screen flickered as files popped up, dozens of them, neatly organized into folders. She clicked on one labeled Operations. A list of locations appeared. Warehouses, shipping yards, abandoned buildings. Rachel's stomach turned. She clicked on another file. Names filled the screen. Some she recognized, local politicians, police officers, business owners. Corruption ran deep. She clenched her fists. Then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered. Daniel leaned forward. What is it? Rachel's hands trembled as she pointed at a name on the list. It wasn't just any name. It was a name she had trusted. A name she had respected. It was her captain's name. Daniel's expression darkened. Now you see why I couldn't go to the police. Rachel swallowed hard. Her entire world had just shattered. Rachel's fingers hovered over the laptop trackpad, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her captain, Captain James Holloway, was on the list. She had worked under him for years, respected him, trusted his judgment. He was the kind of officer who commanded a room without raising his voice, the kind who talked about integrity, about doing the job right. And now, his name was sitting in front of her, buried in a file filled with criminals and traffickers. She felt sick. Daniel leaned forward, his expression grim. I know it's a lot to take in. Rachel barely heard him. Her entire career had been built on the belief that she was fighting on the right side, that the badge meant something, that the system wasn't completely broken. But now she wasn't sure of anything. She clenched her fists. How do you know this is real? Daniel sighed. I've spent years collecting this information, Rachel. I cross-checked everything. Bank records, offshore accounts, coded messages. Holloway isn't just involved. He's one of the top guys covering for Darnell. Rachel shook her head, trying to force the lump out of her throat. No, there has to be a mistake. Daniel's voice was quiet. I wish there was. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. The weight of the truth pressed down on her chest. If Captain Holloway was dirty, it meant that every case she had worked under him, every arrest, every conviction, could have been compromised. It meant she had been taking orders from a man who protected monsters. Her stomach twisted. She looked back at the laptop screen, scanning the files. There were transaction logs, security footage, phone call records, all of it painting a picture she didn't want to see. And then, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. A photo. A grainy security camera still, time-stamped just a few weeks ago. Rachel clicked on it. The image expanded, and her breath hitched in her throat. It was her captain, standing outside a warehouse, shaking hands with Victor Calloway. Rachel's vision blurred with anger. There was no more denying it. No more telling herself it was a misunderstanding. Her captain was dirty. And worse, he was in deep with the very man who had just tried to kill her. She slammed the laptop shut, standing so fast that her chair scraped against the wooden floor. Daniel watched her carefully. Rachel. She sucked in a sharp breath. She couldn't find the words. She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Daniel leaned forward. I know it feels like your world just flipped upside down. I've been there. But we don't have time to process it right now. Rachel's jaw tightened. Then what do we do? Daniel exhaled. We expose them. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. You just said the police are compromised. How do we expose them when we don't even know who we can trust? Daniel hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Rachel picked it up, unfolding it carefully. A name was scrawled on it. Agent Mark Ridley, FBI. Rachel frowned. Who is this? Daniel leaned back. He's the only one I trust. He's been investigating Darnell for years, but he never had enough evidence to make a move. He gestured toward the laptop. This changes everything. Rachel stared at the name, her mind whirling. Could she really trust this agent? Could she trust anyone at this point? But before she could ask another question, A noise outside made her freeze. A car engine. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. Daniel moved fast, closing the laptop and grabbing the USB drive. They found us. Rachel rushed to the window, peeking through the blinds. Headlights cut through the trees, casting long shadows against the cabin walls. A second set of lights flickered behind it. 2 vehicles. The gunman had followed them. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath. We're trapped. Daniel's jaw tensed. Not yet. He moved toward the back door, but before he could reach it, the cabin erupted with gunfire. Bullets tore through the wooden walls, splintering the furniture, shattering glass. Rachel hit the floor hard, her ears ringing. Daniel landed beside her, shielding the USB drive with his body. The gunfire stopped. A heavy silence followed. Then, a voice. Low, taunting. Rachel Owens, the man called. Rachel's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Victor Calloway. I know you're in there, he continued. And I know you've been talking to my old friend Daniel. Rachel's hands tightened around her gun. Victor chuckled. I have a proposition for you, officer. Come outside, and we'll talk like civilized people. Rachel didn't move. Daniel's voice was low. He's playing with you. Rachel already knew that. Victor's tone darkened. Or, we can do this the hard way. Another gunshot rang out, this one blasting a hole through the cabin door. Rachel and Daniel locked eyes. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and if they didn't come up with a plan fast, they weren't getting out of this alive. Rachel's mind raced. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of gunpowder and splintered wood. Outside, Victor Calloway and his men surrounded them, their weapons aimed, waiting for her. She gritted her teeth. Victor had used her name. That meant he knew exactly who she was. And that was bad. Very bad. Daniel shifted beside her, keeping his body low. We don't have much time, he murmured. They'll breach any second. Rachel's grip tightened around her gun. They were pinned down with limited ammo, no backup, and no easy escape route. If they walked out, they were dead. If they stayed, they were dead. She forced herself to think. There's always a way out. A gust of wind rattled the cabin's walls, and then Victor's voice came again. You're not a part of this, Officer Owens, he said, his tone almost amused. You can still walk away. Rachel let out a slow breath, steadying her nerves. Funny, she called back. You don't shoot at someone you want to walk away. Victor chuckled. Fair point, but I'm giving you one last chance. Hand over Daniel and that little flash drive, and I let you live. Rachel's jaw clenched. And if I say no? The amusement in Victor's voice vanished. Then I burn that cabin to the ground. A cold chill ran down Rachel's spine. He wasn't bluffing. Daniel leaned in. There's an old maintenance hatch under the floorboards, he whispered. It leads to a crawl space. If we can get to it, we might have a shot. Rachel nodded. Cover me. Daniel rolled onto his side, aiming his gun toward the broken windows. Rachel reached down, fingers searching along the floorboards. After a few frantic seconds, she felt it, an iron handle, cold against her palm. She yanked it open just as another round of gunfire erupted outside. Dust and cobwebs filled the small space beneath the cabin. It was barely big enough to fit both of them, but right now, it was their only option. Go, Rachel whispered urgently. Daniel slid in first, holding the USB drive against his chest. Rachel followed, pulling the hatch shut just as the front door exploded inward. Boots stomped inside. Rachel held her breath, pressing her body flat against the dirt floor. A familiar voice sneered above them. Search the place. Victor was inside. Rachel's pulse pounded. The crawl space was dark, damp, and barely wide enough to move, but if they stayed quiet, they might have a chance. Above them, footsteps creaked across the wooden planks. A second voice, one of Victor's men, spoke up. They were just here. Rachel felt Daniel shift slightly beside her. The air was thick with tension. If one of them made even the smallest sound, it was over. Victor's footsteps grew louder. Then he stopped, just inches from where they were hiding. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. Keep moving. Keep moving. But Victor didn't move. Instead, he chuckled. A dark, knowing sound. You know, Rachel, he mused. I remember your mother. Rachel's entire body went rigid. Daniel's eyes snapped toward her. Victor sighed. It's been, 15 years? He let out a mock whistle. Time flies, doesn't it? Rachel's breath hitched. No, 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 no. Her fingers curled into the dirt. Her mind screamed at her to stay quiet, to not react. But it was too late. Victor heard it. The faintest hitch in her breath. The scrape of movement. Then, a single gunshot blasted downward, tearing through the floorboards above. Rachel and Daniel rolled just in time, the bullet missing them by inches. "They're under the floor," one of Victor's men shouted. Rachel grabbed Daniel's arm. "Run!" They scrambled forward, army crawling through the darkness as more bullets rained down. Dirt flew into Rachel's eyes, but she didn't stop. The crawl space stretched out ahead, narrow and suffocating, but it led somewhere. A dim light flickered in the distance. An exit. Daniel saw it too. Almost there. But then, a pair of hands ripped open the hatch above them. A man lunged, grabbing Rachel's ankle. She kicked hard, slamming her boot into his face. He yelled, stumbling back, and she kept moving. They reached the end of the tunnel. A small grate covered the exit. Rachel shoved at it, pushed with everything she had. The rusted metal gave way, and they tumbled out onto the damp forest floor. Rachel gasped for air. Daniel pulled himself up, gripping her arm. "Move." They took off through the trees, feet pounding against the earth. Behind them, Victor's men were scrambling out of the cabin, shouting orders, firing bullets into the dark. But Rachel and Daniel were already disappearing into the forest. The night swallowed them whole. 15 minutes later, they stopped. Rachel braced herself against a tree, chest heaving. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow, glancing back. No sign of pursuit. For now. Rachel turned to him, eyes blazing. "He knows who I am." Daniel hesitated. "Rachel." She cut him off. "My mother. He said he remembers my mother." Her fists clenched. "What does that mean?" Daniel was silent. Rachel's stomach twisted. "You knew, didn't you?" Her voice was sharp, accusing. "You knew this was personal." Daniel swallowed. "I had my suspicions." Rachel's head spun. This wasn't just about Victor. It wasn't just about Darnell. It was about her family, her past. She had spent 15 years chasing a ghost. And now, the ghost was chasing her. Rachel took a shaky breath. "We need to find Agent Ridley," she said. Daniel nodded. Agreed. But before they could move, a new sound cut through the forest. A low, mechanical buzzing. Rachel frowned. "What is that?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Drones." Rachel's blood turned to ice. They weren't just being hunted by men. They were being tracked. Rachel's breath hitched as the mechanical buzzing grew louder, cutting through the silence of the forest. Drones. Her pulse spiked. She had expected Victor's men to come after them. But this was a whole new level of bad. Daniel grabbed her wrist and yanked her behind a thick tree trunk. "They're scanning the area," he whispered urgently. "Infrared, motion sensors. If they catch our heat signatures, we're done." Rachel clenched her jaw. "You didn't mention they had this kind of tech." Daniel exhaled. "Darnell has resources. More than you know." Rachel peeked around the trunk, heart hammering. 3 drones hovered overhead, their red scanning lights sweeping through the trees like searchlights. They moved in perfect synchronization, covering every possible escape route. A sick feeling curled in Rachel's stomach. This wasn't just some gang hunting them down. This was organized, professional. And if they were using drones, that meant they weren't planning to take prisoners. Daniel's grip tightened on her wrist. "We have to move. Now." Rachel nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. Low and slow, they crouched and started moving, keeping their bodies low to the ground. The dirt was cold beneath Rachel's palms as they crawled forward, inch by inch. The buzzing above them was relentless. Rachel's heart pounded. They had to find cover, fast. Then, she spotted something. About 20 yards ahead, hidden beneath thick branches, was a creek bed. The water was shallow, but it was moving, which meant it might be cold enough to mask their heat signatures. She turned to Daniel. "The water. It'll hide us." He frowned. "You sure?" Rachel wasn't sure about anything right now, but they were out of options. "We either try, or we get spotted." Daniel hesitated for only a second. Then he nodded. "Let's go." They moved fast, staying low. The drones whirred above them, scanning, searching. Rachel held her breath, waiting for the moment an alarm blared. But it didn't. Not yet. They slid into the icy water, the shock of it stealing Rachel's breath. It was freezing. Daniel sucked in a sharp breath beside her, but neither of them made a sound. Rachel flattened herself against the creek bed, submerging as much of her body as possible. The water stung against her skin, but she forced herself to stay still. The drones hovered above them. Rachel didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, A high-pitched beep. Rachel's stomach dropped. They found us. Daniel grabbed her wrist. Run! They exploded from the water just as the drones activated their alarms. A piercing, mechanical screech filled the air, followed by a voice. Targets located. Rachel's blood ran cold. The chase was on. Gunfire erupted from the distance. The men had heard the alert. Rachel and Daniel bolted, feet slipping in the mud as they tore through the forest. The drone stayed right on them, scanning, tracking. Branches slashed at Rachel's arms as she ran. Her lungs burned. Her boots sank into the wet earth, but she kept pushing forward. A bullet whizzed past her head, slamming into a tree. They weren't just shooting to scare them now. They were trying to kill them. Daniel grabbed her arm. We need to lose them, fast. Rachel's mind raced. Think. Then she saw it. Up ahead, a massive fallen log stretched over a deep ravine. The ravine itself was at least 30 feet deep, filled with jagged rocks at the bottom. But it was their only shot. Rachel pointed. The log, we can cross it. Daniel's face paled. That thing looks about as stable as a toothpick. Rachel didn't slow down. We don't have a choice. The two of them sprinted toward the log. The moment they reached it, Rachel didn't hesitate. She leapt onto the slick, moss-covered surface and began running across. Below her, the ravine stretched out like a bottomless pit. One wrong step, and she was dead. Behind her, Daniel cursed but followed. The drones whirred louder, closing in. Rachel pushed herself faster, arms outstretched for balance. The log creaked beneath their weight. Almost there. Almost. Crack. Rachel's stomach lurched. The log split beneath them. Jump, Daniel shouted. Rachel leapt just as the wood snapped apart, sending splinters flying into the air. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Daniel landed beside her, groaning. The log crashed into the ravine, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. Rachel gasped for breath, rolling onto her back. They had made it. But the drones? They hadn't. They hovered at the edge of the ravine, scanning wildly, their path blocked by the sudden gap. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. That was insane. Rachel sat up. We're alive, aren't we? Daniel shook his head, still catching his breath. Barely. Rachel didn't have time to enjoy the victory. The drones were rerouting, and the men were probably looking for another way across. They needed to keep moving. Daniel sat up, rubbing his bruised ribs. Where to now? Rachel pulled out the crumpled paper from her pocket. The one with Agent Ridley's name. We find the FBI. Daniel nodded. Then let's move. Rachel clenched her jaw. Victor and his men had thrown everything at them tonight, and they had survived. Now, it was their turn to fight back. Rachel and Daniel didn't stop running until they were deep into the forest, far beyond the reach of the drones. The night stretched on, cold and relentless, but neither of them dared to rest. They had one objective now: find Agent Mark Ridley before Victor's men found them. Rachel's body ached from the chase, her muscles burning with exhaustion, but she pushed forward. The weight of what she had learned, the corruption, the trafficking ring, her captain's involvement, was heavier than any physical pain. Daniel jogged beside her, his breath labored. We need a car. If we stay on foot, we won't make it to Ridley. Rachel glanced at him. He was right. They needed transportation, and they needed it fast. She pulled out her phone, but it was still useless. No signal this deep in the woods. Rachel swore under her breath. Then, a thought hit her. There's an old ranger station about 5 miles east, she said. They keep an emergency jeep there for search and rescue. Daniel looked skeptical. And you're sure it's still there? Rachel nodded. It's our best shot. Daniel didn't argue. Then let's go. They started moving again, pushing through the dense underbrush. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the distant hoot of an owl. Rachel's mind kept circling back to one thing. Victor had recognized her. That meant he knew who she was. He had mentioned her mother, and that terrified her more than anything. Daniel, she said, her voice quieter now. Back at the cabin, when Victor said he remembered my mother, what did he mean? Daniel exhaled sharply. Rachel, now's not the time. Rachel grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. No more secrets. What aren't you telling me? Daniel's jaw tightened. He hesitated, glancing at the dark sky above them like he was searching for the right words. Then he sighed. Your mother was involved in this, in ways you don't understand. Rachel's stomach dropped. What? Daniel swallowed hard. She tried to expose them. Years ago, she got too close. Rachel's heart stopped. She was investigating them, she whispered. Daniel nodded. She wasn't just a random victim. She knew something. Something big. And Victor, he was sent to silence her. Rachel felt like she had been punched in the gut. All these years, she had believed her mother was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But no, it had never been random. Victor had targeted her. Her hands shook as memories of that night flooded back. The screaming, the gunshots, the terror in her mother's eyes. Rachel took a step back. You knew this whole time? Daniel's face was grim. I suspected, but I couldn't be sure, not until now. Rachel turned away, trying to catch her breath. Her mother had been trying to stop them, and they had killed her for it. Now, Rachel wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for her mother. Her fists clenched. We take them down. Daniel nodded. We will. Rachel forced herself to focus. Right now, they needed to reach that ranger station. They picked up the pace, the weight of the truth fueling Rachel's every step. 30 minutes later, they reached the edge of a clearing. Rachel held up a hand, stopping Daniel. That's it. The ranger station sat at the base of a hill, a small wooden outpost with a single parked jeep. The sight sent a wave of relief through Rachel's chest. But then, something felt off. The place was too quiet. Daniel noticed it too. Something's wrong. Rachel scanned the area. No lights. No movement. Her gut twisted. I'll check inside, she whispered. You stay here. Daniel frowned but nodded. Rachel moved carefully, gun raised. Her boots barely made a sound against the wooden steps as she climbed onto the porch. She reached for the door handle, and that's when she saw it. A trail of blood smeared across the threshold. Rachel's breath hitched. No. She pushed the door open slowly. The room inside was a mess. Papers scattered, chairs overturned, signs of a struggle. And in the middle of the floor, a ranger, face down, motionless. Rachel's stomach churned. She knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. Nothing. He was gone. Rachel's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a coincidence. Victor's men had gotten here first. A sound creaked behind her. Rachel spun, gun raised. But it was too late. A figure emerged from the shadows. A gun pressed against her temple. And then, a familiar voice. Did you really think you could run forever, Officer Owens? Rachel's heart stopped. Victor Calloway. Rachel's fingers twitched on her gun. She could try to fight, try to take him down. But before she could make a move, Victor chuckled. Drop it, he said smoothly. Or Daniel dies. Rachel's breath caught. She followed his gaze out the window, and her stomach dropped. Outside, in the clearing, Daniel was on his knees. A gun pressed against the back of his skull. Rachel's hands shook. Victor smirked. There's only one way this ends, officer. Rachel's pulse roared in her ears. She was out of time, out of options. Victor leaned in, his voice a whisper. Now be a good girl, and surrender. Rachel's fingers curled around her gun. She had one last shot, one last move. And if she got it wrong, Daniel was dead. Rachel's mind raced. Victor's gun was pressed against her temple, cold and unyielding. Outside, Daniel was on his knees, a gun aimed at his skull. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She had spent her entire life chasing ghosts, chasing justice. And now, she was one wrong move away from losing everything. Victor smirked. I can see you thinking, Officer Owens. His voice was smooth, taunting. I'd be careful. Thinking gets people killed. Rachel's jaw clenched. She had seconds to act, seconds to survive. Her mind assessed the scene. There were at least 3 of Victor's men outside, one holding Daniel hostage, 2 more scanning the woods. And inside, Victor himself, too close for comfort. Rachel exhaled slowly, keeping her hands steady. You know, Victor, she said, you talk too much. Victor's smirk faltered. Excuse me. Rachel moved. In one fluid motion, she twisted her body, forcing Victor's arm to the side. The gunshot exploded in her ear, missing her head by inches. She didn't give him a chance to recover. Her elbow slammed into his ribs, forcing him back. He cursed, trying to raise his weapon again. Rachel was faster. She grabbed his wrist, yanking the gun out of his grasp. He swung at her, a brutal right hook, but Rachel ducked just in time. And then, she did what she had been waiting 15 years to do. She hit him. Her fist collided with his jaw, sending him staggering backward. He crashed into the table, knocking over papers and a lamp. Rachel didn't stop. She grabbed his gun, aimed it at his chest, and stepped closer. Hands up, Victor. Victor wiped blood from his lip, eyes dark with fury. You think you've won? Rachel's grip on the gun didn't waver. I know I have. She fired. The bullet slammed into his leg, dropping him instantly. Victor screamed, clutching his thigh as blood poured between his fingers. You little. Rachel pressed the barrel of the gun against his forehead. Finish that sentence, and I'll make sure you never say another word. Victor went still. Rachel's pulse was roaring, but she didn't have time to waste. Outside, Daniel. She turned, bolting toward the door just as another gunshot rang out. Her heart seized. Daniel. She burst onto the porch, gun raised. Daniel was still on his knees, the gunman's weapon pointed at his head. Rachel didn't think. She fired twice. The first bullet hit the gunman's shoulder, sending him spinning. The second shot went straight through his leg, dropping him to the dirt. Daniel moved instantly, grabbing the fallen man's gun and knocking him unconscious with the handle. The other two men whipped around, weapons raised. But before they could fire, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Rachel felt relief slam into her. Daniel exhaled. Finally, Victor's men panicked. The moment they heard those sirens, they knew the fight was over. One tried to run, but Daniel fired a warning shot at his feet. The man froze. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark forest. Rachel turned to Daniel, breathing hard. You okay? Daniel gave her a half-smile, despite everything. Better than Victor. Rachel turned back toward the cabin. Victor was still on the floor, clutching his leg, his face twisted in rage. You think this changes anything? He spat. You think you can stop this? Rachel stepped over him, leaning down. You don't get it, do you? She said softly. Victor glared. What? Rachel smiled. You already lost. And then, the first patrol cars arrived. 3 hours later, Rachel stood outside the ranger station, arms crossed as she watched Victor Calloway get shoved into the back of an FBI transport van. His men were already in custody. And Daniel? He was standing beside her, watching the scene unfold. Rachel turned to him. You sure about this? Daniel sighed. I'm done running. He glanced at the van. Darnell won't be happy about this. Rachel's face hardened. Let him come. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. You really are something else, Rachel. She smirked. I've been told that before. Just then, a man in a dark suit approached. Agent Mark Ridley. He nodded at Rachel. You did good, Officer Owens. Rachel exhaled. So what happens now? Ridley's expression was serious. We take this to the top. With the evidence Daniel provided, we have enough to dismantle Darnell's entire operation. He glanced at Daniel. It's risky. You'll have to testify. Daniel shrugged. I've been running from this for years. Time to finish what I started. Ridley nodded. Then let's get to work. Rachel watched as the FBI loaded Victor's men into their cars, as the weight of the past finally started to lift from her shoulders. But she knew this wasn't over. Darnell was still out there. There were still fights to be won. Rachel took a deep breath. Her mother had fought to stop this. And now, Rachel was going to finish it.